I had universal basic income I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about either like the defunding or the abolition of our like kind of policing. And then I had actually no, I narrowed it down to two because the other two were more like stateside policy than so it was just those two that I'm kind of in between about now.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to kind of work through is which, in terms of the power of Congress to address these issues, I'm going to talk about whether they could address each of these issues directly through a power they have in the Constitution or if they'd have to do it indirectly. The first topic that you talked about, guaranteed universal income, that would be something that Congress has the authority to do because it has the power to tax and spend for the general welfare. And so they definitely have the authority to do that. Whether or not they have the political will to do that is a different question. But, and I think the issue you'd be addressing is, and I'm trying to think if it would be more squarely centered under poverty or more squarely centered under unemployment. I mean, there's a lot of things that guaranteed universal income comes under, because you can also even talk about it if you're talking about motivating creativity within a workforce. So for example, an innovation, maybe I might have some great idea for an entrepreneurial startup company of some sort, but I have health needs and I have great health insurance here. And so I'm going to be reluctant to kind of leave this job because of the benefits I get. And people have argued that a guaranteed universal income would help defray some of those costs. Like, well, I could use that money to buy replacement insurance, or I could use that money to have kind of a lifeline while I tried to get something else off the ground. And then they've even talked about how it might make it possible for more people to give their labors to volunteer efforts if they had some sort of guaranteed universal income. So I think that the two issues that it maybe comes most clearly into focus is either in terms of poverty or unemployment and how to deal with that. Now, the other topic about remaking the police forces, that is not something that Congress has the direct authority to do. But there's a variety of ways that Congress could encourage states to do that. Congress could offer incentive money to states that, you know, maybe if they agree to remake their police departments, they'll provide a certain amount of funding. Or they could, you know, to any state who does follow certain guidelines, or they could make a project grant available that would say, okay, we're going to create, you know, $100 million or whatever available to states. It'll be a competitive grant to maybe 3 or 4 states, depending on how the funding goes, that if you come up with a really good model for doing some of this reformation work, you could get this 3-year federal grant. So they couldn't mandate it, but they could encourage it through. Now you might be thinking, well, but then that's not addressing the problem that I want to in as full of a way as you'd like to at the federal level. But on the other hand, if some states were encouraged to do some experimentation because they had a project grant from Congress, it might, you know, and it went well because generally these grants are for 3 years, and then as a part of having gotten the grant, you have to write a report on how it went. If a couple of states, and let's say the states, you know, the 3 or 4 states that get the grant, they have really different models of what they're going to do. Well, then other states look at the relative success or not of what the states in these project grants have been, and they might be motivated based on the success to do something like that. So in some ways, I like that you presented these 2 options, because one is an option that Congress definitely has the authority to act on it directly, whereas the other one is something that Congress doesn't have the authority directly, but through use of its spending powers might be able to entice some states to make some reform. So as I was talking about that, Kyle, did you have thoughts of which direction you might like to go?
Well, just from kind of how you said it, I think I'm just probably going to do UBI, only because like the thought of having to do like a whole project grant or anything, because I was going in the direction of just like somehow nationalizing the police force and then working to steps to kind of like transform it into different sort of um, agencies to deal with, you know, so like we can like de-arm, de-escalate kind of the militarized police force that we have and whatever. But honestly, just like going through it in my head now, I'm just like, actually, this sounds like a lot of work for a semester where I have not much motivation. So I'm probably going to end up doing UBI because I've already done a lot of research on UBI as it is, because that was my first policy report I was working on. So I think I'm just going to do that.
Well, and especially thinking, you know, we haven't gotten to the stage yet where I'm having you research some various proposals of how to address the problem. But yeah, the one proposal about nationalizing the police force, some real big constitutional hurdles there, as well as the political feasibility, I think it's kind of low on that. Because one of the concepts we're going to talk about as the semester moves on is that most policy that actually gets passed and goes into effect is pretty incremental. It's kind of rare that there's like a whole new thing. And to the extent that there are whole new things, and there are, they tend to be small issues. The big issues tend to go forward in more incremental ways. Given the fact that states have reserved powers, I think you'd almost maybe need a constitutional amendment to nationalize the police force in the way that you're thinking about. And there's not a lot of, it's not that I don't want you to work on projects that it would be difficult to convince Congress, but yeah, that one at the moment, that just would have such a tough time making its way through Congress. As we go along and we start looking at options to address the problems that you pick, and again, we're not there yet, but we'll also eventually start looking at how do we evaluate these various proposals that you're going to put forward. And in order to, to keep anybody from getting too nervous, when I talk about coming up with policy proposals, you don't have to come up with these ideas. You'll be finding ideas that think tanks and other people have proposed and just kind of locating them, and then you'll be coming up with evaluative criteria with which to evaluate and rank them. But one of the key criteria that you're going to be using is political feasibility. You're going to find, most of you, as you work on your policy projects, that somewhere along the line, you're going to find a proposal that you think would be the most effective proposal in terms of actually addressing the problem and solving a lot of the problem. and yet that probably won't be the proposal that you recommend. And you might be thinking, well, that just sounds crazy. You know, why would the most effective one not be the one you recommend? Because after you've evaluated the proposal, you get to choose all of the evaluative criteria except for one, which I require that you have, and that's that you're all going to be required to have political feasibility as one of your criteria. And so it's not unusual for it to be the case that as effectiveness rises, political feasibility drops. And so sometimes in order to have a chance of something passing, you have to pick an option that maybe isn't quite as effective. And you might be thinking, that just doesn't sound right. Well, if these things were not controversial, these fixes that you're coming up with, odds are we would have already done that thing. And so you're coming at it from a point where one person's fix is another person's new problem as far as policy goes. So yeah, I'd be more comfortable with you working on the guaranteed basic income, although you're going to have to figure out, you don't have to do it for this time, but eventually for the next time, you're going to have to start thinking about, well, what is the problem that I'm trying to address? And that's why I was struggling a little bit with what issue to put it in. Is it about poverty and making sure that nobody is in abject poverty, or is it about lower levels? Well, it actually might even create higher levels of unemployment if some people say, you know what, that's enough for me. Anyway, you know, you're going to frame the problem.
Yeah, from what I kind of think I'm going to frame it as a poverty problem because of just like what I've read so far. It's not really an unemployment thing because a lot of the studies that I've kind of saw were like, yeah, unemployment's not really going up or down with this. So I think I'm mostly just going to frame it more as kind of like an eradication of poverty type deal. But I don't, that might change over time. So
yeah, or an abolition of destitute level poverty. Because the amounts, you know, $1,000 a month or whatever some of these amounts are, would still put people at pretty low levels of income if that was their only income. But certainly you could eke out some sort of existence at least on that amount, and you know, along with some other initiatives, have a roof over your head and whatnot. So yeah, no, I think that's a worthwhile issue, and it meets the, you know, I think it would be workable with our policy analysis. Does anybody else kind of want to talk about their policy issue?
I was thinking about legalizing drugs.
Okay, now that is definitely something that the national government could do. You probably will want to get a little bit more specific, although you don't have to do that for this first one, because and you might find yourself advocating for something that's even kind of a halfway step. One of the biggest impediments to making policy change with regard to, say, marijuana is that it's a Schedule I drug by the federal government. So even though some states have decriminalized or even legalized not just medicinal use, but recreational use, the federal government it's still illegal at the federal government level, because being a Schedule I substance means that it's in a category that means there's no legitimate purpose for it, no legitimate medical purpose. So it's not just that it's controlled, but it's like you can't get money for research. And it's kind of, you know, we haven't had huge gold standard research done on the large scale of the kinds of testing that you'd need to see, are there some other things going on? Because universities haven't been able to get research money because it's illegal. So even just taking it off the Schedule 1 would be a huge step forward, both in terms of research and making it easier for states to conduct this business. They've had a lot of trouble with banking, for example, in states that have either made it legal for medicinal purposes or recreational purposes, because if it's, the Supreme Court heard a case where can it exist that a state makes something legal that the federal government makes illegal? The case came out of California, which was one of the early medicinal use states. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that can be a thing. So to some extent, marijuana is legal to the extent that the federal prosecutors don't feel like prosecuting it. If they decided they wanted to prosecute it someday, even in a state where it was legal, they could. But the problem that makes more than just people being kind of fearful is that it's really hard to even get a checking account, let alone for a business that's illegal at the federal level, because it puts it just in such a tenuous situation. So even just easing up on some of those things. And then the other thing, it's definitely an issue that Congress has authority over because it's related to commerce. Even when it was illegal in every state of the United States, the Supreme Court said that illicit drugs impacted interstate commerce, and therefore it was something that Congress could regulate. So definitely it's within the authority of Congress to do that. Somebody else asked about voting rights, and in the chat, that's a tough one, because when our Constitution was written and it divvied up the chores and responsibility in our federal system, it said that states have both the responsibility and the authority, of the responsibility and the right to handle all things involving elections. And that there were two reasons for that. One, there wasn't a lot of money or funds available at the federal level. Elections are expensive, and to take a federal government with very little income, just the income that came off of import and export taxing, and try to set up an organization of handling elections would have been unfeasible at that point in time. But secondly, there was also the issue of states were suspicious of federal power, and states get to run all elections, not just their state elections, but they get to run national elections as well on a state-by-state basis. And so when a particular congressperson wins, or a state's electoral college votes go towards a particular presidential candidate, that state can say, well, we trust that this was done right because we did it. So in the beginning, that meant that states got to define all aspects of voting, including who got to vote. Over time, starting with the 15th Amendment in 1870, the Constitution has been amended a few times to say, okay, states, you get to define who gets to vote, except that you can't do it for this reason. So in 1870, they said, states, you still are the ones that do elections, except that you can't forbid people to vote because of their race. And then in 1920, Congress said, okay, states, you still get to define who gets to vote, but you can't deny the right to vote because of somebody's race or because of their gender. And then eventually you can't deny the right to vote because of a poll tax. You can't deny the right to vote based on age as long as people are 18 or over. So there have been certain floor level guarantees, but those have all been constitutional amendments because so voting rights in and of themselves would be tough, because that still is mostly, like, in terms of what kind of ID is required, that's all done, that's all determined on the state by state level. And that one's a little bit harder in terms of the enticing with money, I guess you could I suppose you could guarantee a certain amount of money for voting equipment and overseeing to states that agreed to make voter requirements a particular level set by the federal government, and then they'd be eligible for funding. And that's actually might be kind of an interesting proposition. States at this point have the total authority to set all of the requirements for whether or not felons or former felons can vote. That's starting to change. For a long time, it was really difficult to vote if you'd ever been convicted of a felony. That's starting to change in recent years. And then, of course, now, with regard to mail-in ballots, there might be a certain amount of congressional authority attached to that, since Congress creates the post office, and then once things go into the post office, Congress has a certain amount of authority over it. It's kind of interesting. Some states now have said that you can, well, in the past, there were some states that you could post your ballot as late as like election day or something. Now the post office has been saying, could you do it some of these things by this date in order for the logistics to work? And I think this is a project that, I think the mailing part is probably, because I don't want to have projects where the requirement is to amend the Constitution, because that's really getting into something more than just a public policy issue, or it's just becoming too bogged down. So
what about the what law was it that gave the federal government the ability to deny or say no, do it again to certain like southern states when they came to voting requirements? There's the law that, like Alabama, Georgia, the federal government passed that kind of gives them oversight, final approval over states, southern states at least, when they approve.
You're thinking of the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
I think, yes. Would that be
well, it would be, except the Supreme Court, 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember the name of the case right this minute, but they said, you know what?
I missed that memo.
Yeah, no, the Supreme Court said, oh, it's different now. And they basically gutted most of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, although that's interesting, because the Voting Rights Act, for certain states that had levels of disenfranchising African Americans at a certain level or higher, they fell under its supervision until which time, forever, and they'd have to get approved by the Department of Justice any changes to their voting practices. But that was done under the auspices of the 13th and 15th Amendments about slavery, and then voting not being denied on account of race. It's interesting that the new disenfranchisement in its strictest form seems to be based on party, although that has got a significant overlap with race in the United States. In recent years being since the 1930s, African Americans register and vote Democratic at really disproportionate levels. Prior to that, African Americans identified with the Republican Party from the time of the 15th Amendment until the 1930s. But yeah, I mean, that's a good idea, Alex, but except for the Supreme Court getting in the way, but of that one. Oh, here's another one. What I was thinking is where the government guaranteed money and such to make sure states keep and expand voting places important. Now that that actually would work if they, yeah, they could offer to match, you know, sometimes they could offer to match state money for new equipment as long as a certain amount of the equipment was, you know, and precincts and availability to vote was distributed to some level of satisfaction in poor and minority areas. Well, you're allowed to do historical issues, Carolyn, if they are still a problem, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these problems are as old as anything. And even if it's not being talked about right now, because not everything is talked about at any given time, yeah, you can definitely do that. It doesn't have to be an issue that's hot as long as it's a problem as opposed to a condition, meaning a problem for which people think that government could do something to ameliorate the problem. Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious because I'd like to look at the AIDS crisis historically speaking, because I think it's very relevant to what's going on right now.
So, well, I'm taking with what's going on right now with regard to public health and COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to talk about public health and look at the government's previous response to public health through the AIDS crisis.
What would be, eventually you're going to be making policy recommendations, and certainly looking at historical problems and solutions opens up ideas for how to handle it. But you would need to frame it in a way that, I mean, if you could just say, the issue is, you know, we don't seem to handle pandemics, you know, large scale health issues. Well, in AIDS, I don't know if it was ever declared.
I think it was just an epidemic.
But still, large scale health issues that cross state lines, we don't seem to have a very organized way of doing it. And then certainly looking at the AIDS situation. I mean, and you know, this is not the first time, this is not the first pandemic where we've had our big bitter arguments about mask wearing, which I was fascinated to read about. The New York Times had a couple of articles about a month ago about how during the pandemic, the flu epidemic of 1918, people got all pissy about masks in both directions, you know, and you had your maskers and your anti-maskers. And so, you know, people, we rehash a lot of the same things. I thought that was fascinating because some of the things people were slinging back and forth at each other sounded just like something you might hear today in that debate. And this just brings up something I've been kind of curious about, which is, I mean, I only have one class that's in person. It's a freshman class. It's a 1-credit class of undeclared majors, and they all have been great. I haven't had to say anything to anyone about wearing a mask. And I know that you are all upperclassmen, but just amongst young people in general, do you guys, when you're close, and I'm not going to rat you out, but when you're close together, do people tend to wear masks, or are people more cavalier about it?
What do you mean by that? Like,
by cavalier?
Oh no, but like when we're with our friends, like in a public place, or like just hanging out in our houses, whatever.
Either one.
Well, I'm always wearing a mask out in public, but like if I'm just hanging out with my friends, like we talk about it, but then it's like just to wear a mask inside, it just seems too weird.
So although just a gentle succession, you could sit and have these conversations outside and not wear your masks, you know, in private outside spaces maybe. The only socializing I've done since March is outside on people's back porches, you know, because it's being outside really makes a difference, because aerosolization, which, yeah, I know that's not a word, but the breeze dispersing that seems to be practically a miracle. And if you're doing it in sunlight, it's even better, because coronavirus doesn't like the sun. But I get that, and I'm not, there's no judgment thrown there. I'm just saying, if you're gonna get together, just go outside if you don't want to wear a mask. But yeah, but then if you're out in public, then that presents the whole problem back again.
The hard issue is when people do go outside, because even if it's not for a reason that they don't want to wear masks, they go outside to socialize. Then they're outside without a mask, and then the complaints come, or then it just looks bad.
Yeah, that just looks bad. I get it. Yeah, leave the windows open.
I'll say locally where I'm at, I'm about an hour outside of Indiana right now, and I've noticed that, like, while my family still wears masks consistently, like, a lot of the people in the stores have not been wearing them. Like, we'll go to the gas station, and like 90% of the people don't have them on, including the employees.
Right. No, I stopped at Fast Times, the screen printing place here in Indiana, and nobody was wearing a mask. For a while at Lowe's, nobody but the employees wore a mask because they had a sign that said we recommend. But once they put it back to require, people started wearing their masks again. But do other students think it's stupid, the mask thing? Do they feel like, or does it become a rights issue? Like, I have a right not to wear a mask, or?
I was talking in a meeting before this, answering questions about what students thought. But really, it's for a lot of students. I mean, we have had 19 new cases. None of them are serious. I bet some of the students know people that are our age that have it. Not serious, not much more than a cough or a fever. It makes it hard for people to be like, well, I really need to wear my mask because I don't want to get it, or I don't want to spread it to someone else. And that's just one piece in a whole bunch of different pieces, I think, in the thinking of students. And not all students think that way either. There are a lot of students that are consistently wearing masks, self-isolating or social distancing as well, on and off campus.
Sure. No, and we get so many mixed signals. I just saw another question. Could gerrymandering be disincentivized at the federal level? I'm trying to think I'm not sure they could offer enough money to disincentivize some states to not do it. In theory, I suppose you could. Yeah, there could be like a project grant for, I think it would have to be like, and I'm always thinking in terms of like the possible proposals that would come out of this, and would Congress have the authority to do some of these things? So you could, maybe Congress could offer money to states who come up with nonpartisan ways to draw up redistricting plans. This would be the time to do it too, because every 10 years, we have the census, and then based on the census, they'll do the reapportionment, which means they'll decide of our 435 members of the House, some states will gain some seats, some states will lose some seats, and then the states that gain or lose seats have to redraw those maps. And the Constitution says states get to do it. But the Supreme Court has said things like, if a state wants to give that authority to a bipartisan commission, say, that's constitutional. It doesn't have to be the state drawing it itself. If the state passes a law saying you can do this. So yeah, there might be a way to, I'm trying to think if there, because you put it as disincentives, sort of like, the drinking age and the disincentive of not getting your federal highway funds. I'd have to think about it a little bit more. I think there probably are some ways to do that, even though I'm not coming up with them. But my sense is, yeah, that you could probably work on that, because certainly in terms of public policy, it's a huge problem because it's skewing, whether Democrats or Republicans do it, it skews who's in power, and that delegitimizes and creates controversy. And yeah, it's a huge, huge, huge problem. Anybody else have a policy issue they want to talk about a little bit?
Just an idea, maybe prescription drug prices.
Wait, say it again?
Prescription drug prices.
Yeah, I mean, that would certainly be something that Congress could do, because pharmaceutical products cross state lines and so are subject to regulation. Yeah, definitely. And that certainly is a problem. You know, we have the highest. There might be a couple of ways to go about it. It could be about making, you know, economic deals with pharmaceutical companies, but something that Congress has direct and complete authority over is patent law. I mean, just changing some of the patent laws might be the more direct way to do it. So yeah, definitely, because our patents are quite strong and robust and long-lived. And so changing some of the incentive structure of our patents might be a way to go about it, definitely. As well as, you know, I wonder, well, that's, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to work with there, definitely. And that Congress has the authority to do directly, so. Any last things before we go back to looking a little bit at Congress? And it won't be for a huge amount of time. Okay, so let's do this. So you guys generally know how a bill becomes a law. I thought that we'd have a couple of moments of frivolity today, and since I've been teaching online, this week is the first time I've had a chance to return to some moments of frivolity in my teaching, which are when we take a little bit of a mental break by doing something a little bit different that's related to the content, but also just kind of fun. And pedagogically, meaning philosophy of teaching, these are, I think, sound things to do because your brain can only absorb so much before it needs refreshing. So I thought we could watch the Schoolhouse Rock version of how a bill becomes a law. Congress is one of our actors, our official actors. Yeah, we got one Schoolhouse Rock fan, so let's.
As your body grows bigger.
Wait, that's.
As your body grows bigger.
That's not. There we go.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
So there are some problems with that portrayal. You know, it's a little oversimplified and whatnot. And we could talk about that in a little bit. But I have, oh, actually, that one's going to be too long. Okay. We are at the 3-minute mark. So I am probably going to call it a day. Don't forget your first policy progress reports, policy analysis progress reports are due Friday, and it doesn't matter what time on Friday, and you can upload those on D2L, and there's a little spot for that. And any final questions? Oh, media relations to policy. Sean, the problem with that, off the top of my head, is that's some part of that's more of a cultural thing as opposed to a legal thing, and the part of it's protected by the First Amendment, which says that Congress can't restrict, it can't censor what the media publishes. And beyond that, what were you thinking, Sean?
Not exactly sure. I'm kind of just looking for guidance, just throwing ideas out there.
Sure, and I'm sure a lot of people are saying, Sean, I'm not sure what I'm doing either. So, yeah, that would be hard just because of the Congress is not supposed to mess with that relationship too much. I mean, there might be something there. And you can send me an email if you want to toss out something a little bit more specific. And the only reason I'm saying an email is because we're coming to the close of our time together. So, well, any of you are free to send me an email or, you know, set up a Zoom if you want to talk between now and Friday. It's all good. So, keep safe. Wear your masks out in public, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.